title of this session will be Civil-Military Relations, the Way Forward. Dr. Miqdad will be moderating the session. Dr. Miqdad is an assistant professor of Islamic economics at Sabah ad-Din Zaim University here in Istanbul, as well as he is a research fellow at Center of Islam and Global Affairs at SIGA. Abdulrahman, the word is yours.
وش نقدر يا يحيى؟
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Okay, everybody. This is going to be our last session. This is the way we will start. We'll start with Dr. Lu'ay Safi. For Dr. Lu'ay Safi, he's going to do his presentation and then we'll immediately take questions because he has a flight to catch. And then I'll introduce the remaining panelists. And from there, we'll have a usual discussion. Dr. Lu'ay Safi is a professor of political science at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Dr. Safi taught at many universities in the US, including Wayne State University, University of Michigan, and he also taught at the Islamic University of Malaysia. He's the founding member of the Syrian National Council and the Syrian National Coalition. Dr. Safi has authored 15 books. Among those are the Quranic narrative, tensions and transition in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, and peace and the limits of war. Dr. Lu'ay, you can take your time. I don't need to, yani.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to all of you. And the topic of my presentation is military politics and democracy. So I have a lot of room to maneuver, but I decided to focus down on the question of civil-military relationships in the Muslim societies, but definitely I'm not going to talk about Muslim societies because these are too diverse. You can talk about them in one breath. And so my focus would be mainly on some of those countries that's really representatives of a larger group of countries. And mainly I'll make some references to Pakistan, Egypt, and I have some references to Syria in my paper, but probably I may not do that because Egypt is a good model to talk about Syria as well, particularly in the area of civil-military relationships. So let me, at the beginning, provide you with my basic argument so that if I don't have time to cover all the grounds, at least you know what I was talking about. I have 3 points that form the foundation of what I'm going to argue about. Number one is that the formation of a countable political system presupposes 2 things. Number one, a critical mass of people with civic discipline and mature political culture or outlook. So what I'm talking here is about a set of public values that are nurtured in that society. And so people, when they think about the public sphere, they think about it out of those foundational values. Without that, really, we can't talk about democracy, although I'm using the term accountable political system, because really that's the end of democracy. If we have a democracy as a formal system that lack the value aspect of democracy, we are talking about a lot of the things we see in the Middle East, where you have these rituals of elections that produce the same guy and the same group of people who are linked to that guy, and we end up with a corrupt system that unable to cater for the need of the population. So that's number one. Number two, vibrant civil society. No democracy can be really practiced for long without a vibrant civil society. By that I mean civil society institutions, where people are organized around certain interests that relate to the public sphere. That's number one. The second part of my argument is that the civil military elites in many Muslim societies, and I don't see this dichotomy between corrupt politicians and very upright military people. You know, we have partnership, which I call civil military partnership, and hence the term elites. In many Muslim societies that inherited the post-colonial state. But not only that, they have inherited also the colonial attitude and practices toward the population. And that leads me to the third argument that I make in this paper, that this colonial attitude of the ruling elite can be characterized as one of disdain, meaning looking at the population from above, as if these are not our equal, and hence patriotism is very patriotic and uncompromising. There is no way for the elites to compromise with these lay people who don't know what they are doing, and they cannot appreciate the contribution of the elites. And therefore, with this kind of attitude, it is, in my view, the right way to describe those post-colonial systems as providing a form of internal colonialism. So what we have in many Muslim societies, I don't want to generalize for all, some are doing better than others, but there are some examples which will strike you as really nothing but internal colonialism, where the ruling elites behave exactly like the colonial power. And they have inherited, those kind of behaviors somehow. I'm not going to go into explanation, but of course, this is another talk and presentation and paper, but they have inherited those qualities. Now, with regard to the issues of colonial attitude, now, there is a lot of literature about that. And I have provided some examples, but probably a quick reference to that attitude as it described by the literature is sufficient at this point. So my argument here is that the colonial powers that conquered most of the Muslim societies and worked hard to shape it in particular form, they viewed their colonial subjects as inferior populations, incapable of responding rationally to their plans and development strategies. So these were people who are not able to understand what this white burden, as the French philosophers used to call it, they don't understand the burden of the European civilizational forces that came to their shores. And hence their paternalistic attitudes toward the population they control is unmistakable. And we have today a wealth of literature on that. The words that are used really by some of the people who were active in the colonial enterprise toward the population, they use the word children, pupils or pupil infants, minors, and in fact, someone like Marcel Olivier, as late as 1950s, has the following to say about the burden that he has and his understanding of colonialization. Of course, he was, as some of you might know, was the Governor General of Madagascar. So he described, colonialization. He said, that it's quite clear that colonialization, when worthy of its name, establishes between the colonizing country and the colonized peoples a relationship which can be compared to that of mutual obligations and reciprocal services we find in a family between parent and children. So the colonial power and those who are having the burden of colonizing these uncivilized population have to deal with them like children. Now, definitely this attitude, in fact, which is surprisingly at the beginning, you could find it, in fact, in the attitude of public officials today in many Muslim countries. They don't engage the population. They don't think that they are worthy of being engaged, and therefore you find two things. You find condescending attitude in the sense that they have plans for developing those regions, never consulted with the population, never asked them, what do you think? Are these curricula good? Do you have any input? Should we improve it? What about this policy? What about that policy? Of course, that is not part of what public officials are trained to do in many Muslim societies, including, of course, societies like Pakistan and Egypt and Syria. Of course, probably that would not sit well with some of us, but if you think about it, and I would like some of you to challenge this, really there is no, the political leaders don't see themselves as, obligated to engage the population and seek their consent or appreciation or understanding of their policies. They are just top-down. And then, interestingly, when the population disagrees and protests, then exactly like the colonial powers, you find this internal colonial regimes use military force without negotiation, without sort of trying to compromise, no compromise, and they make sure that there's a high cost for those who disagree with their policies. So that definitely brings us to that. Then, let me jump to the conclusion and talk about the way forward. Of course, there is a need to say something about civil society, but I'm going to say it in a way of concluding my remarks so I don't really take much time. I need to really apologize for my co-panelists that I will not be able to attend their presentation. So that is enough. I don't want to intrude into their time. So there are 4 suggestions about what to do in terms of overcoming this internal colonial state, which is a post-colonial, but its ways really can be described, in my view, as internal colonialism. Now, number 1, and let me say one word before I talk about that. I would like to talk about the elite. So the elite is not really those cold-hearted generals, but it is also the enlightened elites, the modernists, who are collaborating with them in every step of the way. And in Pakistan, in Egypt for sure, and in Syria, those tend to be, cohorts. They're always together. They see eye to eye. They have the same morality and the same attitude, the same views about society and about their role in that society. So the problem here, it seems to me that the ruling elites somehow don't see themselves as representatives of the people. They see themselves as guardians, and they expect always obedience from the population. When the population doesn't obey, then they get so angry. Who are these people who are going to challenge our attempt to develop our countries and make them, give them better deal? And I have no doubt that some of them believe of that rhetoric. In fact, it's easy for you to believe it if you are in a position of power, and if you have already been corrupted. It's easy to see yourself as a savior against population that doesn't understand what you are doing. So now comes to the way forward. Now, four things. Number one, the elites, of course, we need now an elite who become more organically connected with the population. Unlike those elites or intellectuals who are organically connected to the state, to this colonial or internally colonial state, who seem to be more beholden to influences and demands from the outside than demands from the inside. So they would not care about what 10, 20, 70 millions would think about, but they would care about a few bureaucrats in some of those the former master colonies would think about their behavior and what they should be doing. And so what we need this shift into an organic leadership. So there's an issue of leadership really here in terms of the elites and the intellectuals. Are these intellectuals just satisfied with getting the good salaries, being co-opted by the state at the expense of what's happening to the population? I see it now becoming more urgent because of the nature of these postmodern societies, post-colonial society, I should say, because they are gradually going into a more cornered, region, that something has to be done before the whole thing would collapse. So then back again, developing, the intellectuals, the elites must be engaged in developing a vibrant civil society. It is tough, difficult, but it's possible despite the military, heavy-handed, and it's becoming more possible in many parts of the world for reasons I don't have time to talk about, but this is one way forward. Then number two, promote normative consensus. So, in fact, those intellectuals and those religious leaders in Muslim societies, even those who keep talking about Islam and the greatness of Islam, they would never bring morality to the public space. Morality is always private. Nothing you can do in the public is questioned or even taught or even written about by those moralists within Muslim communities. They just talk about what should you do to go individually and let everybody go to hell, to paradise. Let everybody go to hell. That's what you have to do. But what have you to do to meet your moral responsibility is in the public sphere, in the public space. That is missing. And of course, by moral consensus, I also mean that really it's not my way or the highway. So Muslim societies tend to be very diverse, even in terms of religion and sectarian composition. And so people have to seek middle ground. And to me, this middle ground really is about not doctrines and about ideas, but mainly is about values, human values, about justice, about equality, about freedom, about caring about each other, caring about the weak and the less powerful in society. Number three, and I see that the clock is ticking. Number three, building commitment to public morality, which is really an addition to consensus, as we said. We have in the Muslim world today, and I have been seeing those, interacting with those very closely. You have Islamists and you have secularists. Really, what you need is really to emphasize the secularists have values. They have human values. You may not agree with some of their moral choices, but in terms of the public sphere, they have those values that the Islamists care about, but then the Islamists are almost bent to try to create a Sufi-like or religious-like states where everybody is, very, very Puritan in their thinking and behavior, even though, many of them are failing in terms of moral behavior. But so again, the point is consensus about what is needed for all of us to live in this public space. And mainly it's about mutual respect, and it's about maintaining the important values of protecting human life, of property, in terms of public property at least, and of really taking care of each other. There are some measures of, and finally, enhance trade and economic cooperation among countries, but that's another issue. But I did not really share with you, and it will be in my paper, is those examples of deliberate insulation of the elite from the public. For example, I talked about the gated communities in Karachi and in many parts of Pakistan, where those who well-to-do have fences, have services not available available outside those fences, and they have security, they have a lot of their needs met, but then that will insulate them from the issues that are facing the larger population. The same thing in Egypt. You have these enclaves. Some of them are so huge, 70,000 people live in an enclave, that you have schools, you have clubs, you have resorts, you have cinemas, you have theaters, and then there are guards outside that will not allow Egyptians to get inside without a permission from somewhere. This is a colony. And in fact, I talked about the history of colonies that was started by the Brits, the Garden City, and then you have this Heliopolis, city, which became a model, by the way, for current enclaves. And those enclaves are quite insulated. You go there, the world is great. Everything is beautiful, green. And in fact, so green that much of the population have shortage of water, so that those enclaves have not only water to drink, but they have water to irrigate a desert. And so these deserts look like as green, or better green than those, a greenery area in a place like Northern Europe or the United States, where rain is almost, a regular thing. And I have seen in places where it's a desert, but this grass is so green in summer that I have never seen any place in the United States as green like that. I mean, we know that even in the north, in Indianapolis or in Washington, D.C., when the heat becomes so severe, then the grass become really yellow, but not in those enclaves. It's still green, while the larger population is unable to drink. So I will stop here. I know I have provoked enough people, but this is really my presentation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lu'ay. Have a seat.
Okay.
Okay, we'll immediately take a few questions. I'm just going to make one real quick comment. So Dr. Safi basically mentioned 3 phases. The first phase was when colonial powers existed. And then the second phase, which is the phase we basically live in, where internal powers exist. And then the third phase, which is the way forward. My question is, what did it take for Muslim communities, Muslim countries, to transition from the first phase to this phase, and what will it take to transition to the phase that you described after the way forward, or as the way forward? We'll take 1 or 2 questions real quick. All right, we'll start right here.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Dr.
Please make your question
it's just a
short and
question.
quick.
It's just a brief one. Dr. Lu'ay, you talked about morality as something that lies in the private space, and but nonetheless, you want elites in post-colonial societies to bring about morality to the public space. It's quite a big conceptual kind of thing. So what kind of baggage do you think we may need to bring together so that we would enable elites to bring morality to the public space? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take question Dr. Sami and Dr. Iqbal, and then we'll have the last question with here in third row, our last question. I'm sorry for the rest.
In the Islamic discourse, there's a school of thought, the school of sama wa ta'a, listen and obey, which is different. I mean, this is mostly in the monarchies, but also we find it in the military-controlled societies, where it's one-way street. The leadership gives you directions, and you must just follow as long as they put some conditions. Now, I'd like to hear your opinion of with this school of thought, which this is what's being basically promoted by Muslim scholars now, especially those who are close to authority. Where do you think current societies, modern Muslim societies, how could they deal with this school of thought?
Okay, we'll still get you.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your presentation, and I agree with your general analysis of the ailment of elitism. So one question is, to what extent do you think structural reforms in terms of how citizens can become members of the elite, so the concept of social mobility, which I think is something that distinguishes, for example, the United States from other societies, including in Europe, that are much more exclusivist in who becomes members of the elite. And so rather than necessarily changing the culture all at once, but perhaps changing the structures that creates more fluidity and more exchange between who, where you were, when you were born, or what class you were born in doesn't determine what class you will die in. And I'm particularly interested in the judiciary as a lawyer, and who becomes a judge, which themselves they're members of the elite. And we could talk about the military as well, et cetera. But do you think that there's whether that's feasible and how one would implement that without getting resistance from the elite? Because as we heard from the prior Minister of Justice in Egypt, a janitor could never become a judge, if you remember that very insulting statement. Thank you.
Thank you for a very good presentation. I endorse your kind of analysis of this hyper-coercive post-colonial state. But I see a disconnect. You started off by kind of laying out two prerequisites for accountable government. One was political culture, the other was civil society. Now, political culture is a very problematic kind of variable. There was an article, I forget when it came out, 30 years ago, which said culture is a cause in search of its effects. It's very seductive to say if you don't have a specific value system, the people don't support democracy or deeply internalized, you're not going to get democracy. So democracy needs deep social roots. But the hyper kind of really robust coercive state the colonial kind of internal colonial state that you described, there's a disconnect, because if you go 100 years ago in any of the world's long-standing democracy and ask people what they thought of democracy, their answer is unlikely to be, oh, democracy is the best form of government. So what I'm trying to get at is there's a habituation effect. When you have democratic institutions over a long time, you create a democratic culture. But presupposing political culture as a kind of precondition for democracy is kind of the argument that dictators have used for so long. And I'm not saying that you are, but Lee Kuan Yew famously, we have different values. In America, teens get pregnant, we have family values, this Western democracy, blah, blah, blah. So I was just trying to understand the kind of how you would kind of link these two, this disconnect in your analysis. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay, I think very important questions. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to do justice for them, but like my presentation, this would be just sound bites because you can't really explain everything you talked about, but or you mentioned at least in broader terms. Now, for your question, Abdul Rahman, I think this has been process. Of course, I mean, I would have never thought that this was the case, that we are in the post-colonial state and we have internal colonialism, let's say during Nasser era. Still, things have not been galvanized, so crystallized, maybe I should say. So, but the foundation he put eventually in Egypt led gradually, from Nasser to Sadat to Mubarak, and now to Sisi, and things really become more scary as you watch what's happening to that society, which is really at one point was the beacon of Arab reform and Renaissance. And now 60% of the population are below poverty level, and then it seems, at least on the surface, that there is no hope. So it has been processed, but the roots have to do with the lack of indigenous internal civic culture, civic commitment to the public space, to a vision of society where at the core of it is our values. And definitely I'm not talking about a moralizing society, but I'm talking about a core group within the society that provide the foundation so that people would respect the law, even if there is no camera watching them or a policeman. They stop at the stop sign even if there is nobody around, because they know they are morally required to support the law. Otherwise, society would collapse. So that's what I'm talking about. So this has to happen. And probably that will address your point. I mean, public morality is about being fair to others, thinking about the others, not thinking about only yourself when you make your calculation. Is about thinking that we can win together, and we don't have really to rise. We have to push people down, and so that has to have also a foundation in the culture. Now, I know culture is a very tricky notion, but to me, culture eventually boils down to a set of values that are common, shared by the population, that they justify them through their ideas, through their novels, through theater, but it's all about certain values that make them work together, including mutual respect, respect of human dignity, respect of certain rights, which I don't see it in our part of the world, despite all these cheap talk about human rights. But it's not inculcated, in the family. It's not in the family. It's not in the school. It's not in the curricula. And I have written about that really regarding the Syrian curricula. What are these curricula trying to achieve? This sort of this lone ranger, this hunter, who doesn't need anybody, and by themselves they can conquer the world, and eventually they conquer their own population, and so all of that is missing. Now, sama' al-ta'a, the yes sir, mentality, isn't it? That is inculcated in many Islamic movements. I mean, I spoke about it as early as the 1989 in my first paper that I published. It is there. Unfortunately, people have some model of how things have to be organized for modern Muslim society within the religious community, which is unrealistic, lacking any analytical tools to understand the difference between past and present, and between surface text and the deep meaning, and so that requires really a new education. Probably schools there must be schools, private schools, whatever schools that raise a new generation of leaders. There must be non-governmental organizations, civil society institutions that really raise awareness and create a new type of leadership. We don't have leadership. We have people just who are ambitious, want to grab power and wealth, and they eventually are willing to compromise the whole population if they can get that goal in life. So I guess it is also a failure of society. It's not a failure of the elite, because the elite come out of the masses. Yes, some of them are now trying to isolate themselves, but this will not work. Their institution will collapse. Egypt cannot be maintained through enclaves. If the ordinary Egyptian is not part of the growth of society, the society will not grow. So what I'm saying that eventually, and I start to see it even in Syria, there are, in fact, spaces of freedom for society to jump in, and for the intellectuals and the leaders to start do something about it. And that would lead me to the question of Aqil. I think, really, you see, it's a tricky thing, but you know, Europe, you see Europe today the way it is. In my mind, and I have written about that as well, and I studied it a lot, because an event called religious reformation. Modern democracy is rooted in the Protestant ethic and the Protestant Reformation. Without it, Europe will not become capitalist or energetic, or even question of equality of people would not be raised in that society. And so our Muslim society need people who have a religious commitment to values.
Otherwise, you'll miss your plane.
Pardon me? Yeah.
Otherwise,
so
you'll miss your plane.
2 minutes? I have 2 minutes?
Yani, try.
Okay,
please.
I'll try, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, probably I'll miss my plane. But I'll wind up in 2 minutes, and this is really my final comment. So you need a group of people within the society, a critical mass, I call them. I don't know how much. I lived in the United States, and I know really maybe 60% of Americans don't care about the law unless there is some policeman watching. But there is this critical mass. When it disappears, forget about the society. It becomes like ours, you know. And you know, so these critical mass care about the law, care about certain values. They care about speaking on the behalf of the weak and the downtrodden, speaking truth to power in a rational, you know, organized way, not as really those heroes, individual heroes, want to challenge the whole society. So I think that's eventually what I see. And religion, that's why I see Islam has to play a role. But how do you bring you know, Muslims who are enlightened, at the same time have deep commitment to high values? And so they see them as their identity, as their meaning of their lives, as they live on earth, and that will make the difference. Now, how that will happen, I mean, this is another discussion, but I think it is possible. And I see some elements of that happening because of the continuous, you know, pushing of ordinary people in Muslim societies and Arab societies into the corner. So people are trying to think that, well, the old ways of the Islamists and the secularists are not working. Something else has to emerge, where it is a compromise, really. You know, you need a secular society, meaning no one would force religion on the population and make sure that everybody is free. But at the same time, those people have also to have a strong religious commitment to the moral values in the public sphere in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luay. We wish you a safe trip back to Qatar.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for
No problem. For the remainder of this session, we have with us Dr. Alan Scarr, who will present to us about the impact of civil-military relations on democracy and human rights, lessons learned from Latin America. We also have with us Dr. Hawaz Tagiya from Al Jazeera Center for Studies. And we also have Dr. Ijaz Akram from National Defense University in Pakistan. And finally, we'll have with us Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl. He will join us through FaceTime. For our speakers, Yani, we try to make our speech within 20 minutes. Dr. Allen, please.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're still awake. It's late afternoon. I would like to thank Dr. Sami in particular and his excellent crew at this university, and also in particular all the students who really have been guiding us, feeding us, transporting us, stimulating us intellectually, facilitating good discussions in here and outside this room. I think this has been 3 excellent days of a good learning experience for me. I didn't know very much about any of the countries that are prime on the program before I arrived, and I feel that I have learned a lot during these days, for which I'm very thankful. It also strikes me that there are many parallels between Latin America, which is the region I work on, and the MENA countries when it comes to civil-military relations. Today I'm going to talk about human rights, which is a topic that hasn't really been well covered during this conference. We've touched upon it here and there, but we haven't really spoken about it systematically. So that will be my focus. And I just want to start by saying that cycles of military dictatorships alternating with civil government is also the story of Latin America, not only of the MENA region. And this dates all the way back again to independence in the 1860s and 1870s. However, there has been some recent encouraging democratic development in connection with Huntington's third wave, if you want. And I would like to take you to Latin America just geographically on a map, since this is a region that is going to be not too familiar to many of you. This is a map from 1978. Red means democracy, white means dictatorship. Okay, now check this. 10 years later, you see democracy has spread across the continent, especially the southern part of South America, where there are still civil wars being fought in Central America. Now, sorry, 88. Right, so this is the picture in 88. Now, go 1 point further, 10 years further down the lane, almost all of Latin America, including the Caribbean, is democratic. In 1979, 2/3 of all Latin Americans lived under dictatorship or under internal armed conflict. 5 years down the lane, the picture is totally different. Now, this is not the end of the story. There have been attempts at coups recently, over the last 10 years, in several countries. But the general story is that it is quite democratic. Of course, we can discuss, how consolidated democracy is, how deep democracy is, how genuine democracy is, and I think these are some important issues when we come to discussing civil-military relations. Just to frame my discussion, I would like to point out that there are 3 main important literatures that have to do with the issues that we have been discussing over the last couple of days. One big literature in Latin America is about democratic breakdown, presidential breakdown. The second literature has to do with democratic transition, which we have discussed to a certain point. And the third literature has to do with democratic consolidation, okay? And within the literature on democratic consolidation, there are 3 main strands that deal with civil-military relations in Latin America. The first strand has to do with the military as a political power. This is something we have discussed a lot. The second has to do with the military as an economic actor, which we have also touched upon. And the third strand of literature has to do with the self-perceptions of the military. And this is important because what happens when the military changes its role or changes its focus from maintaining internal security, fighting its own citizens, and being the protector of its citizens? It has to change its mindset. I think that's a very, very important topic. I'm not going to talk about it today. And I'm not going to talk about the military as an economic actor, but I will talk about the military as a political actor and how civilians in Latin America have had a hard time gaining control over the military. And the most contentious issue, I would argue, in civil-military relations on this continent has been the issue of human rights, or more precisely, human rights violations. This is a map showing South America. And I hope this is not my phone. If you swap the colors, red is now authoritarianism, military dictatorships, white is outside the zone. So this shows you 5 Southern Cone countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, who were part of a military repressive right-wing network backed by the United States that dominated the Southern Cone in the 1970s and the 1980s, and their prime purpose was to fight communism and subversions, all opposition against the government. And they exchanged intelligence, exchanged information, killed each other's citizens, put them in mass graves. It was quite bloody. You can see some of the figures on human rights violations, and they vary a lot according to sources. So these are not set in stone, but they give you an impression of the violations that took place. Now, I have been heading a research project covering 9 countries, involving about 20 people from many, many countries in Latin America, working for a period of 4 years, trying to look at these dictatorships in 9 countries or internal armed conflict and see how the conflicts have played out and also what has happened afterwards. So we've looked at different transitions from military dictatorship, from internal armed conflict, or from a mix of the two. In the right-hand column, you can see some of the figures. Human rights violations were vast across the continent, and we're talking torture, extrajudicial killings, rape, forced exile, detained disappearance, and in some couple of cases also genocide. The figures that you see for detained disappeared in the right-hand column are from the formal Truth Commission reports that were endorsed by the states. And the figures vary from about 200 detained disappeared in Uruguay to 200,000 people killed in Guatemala. These are not unsubstantial figures, and they affect a lot of civilians. So, before I move on, let me just show you a picture. This is from a museum, a memory museum in Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina. The people that you see, the faces that you see, are people who disappeared during the dictatorship in Argentina between 76 and 83, okay? And the children sitting in front are, it might be their grandparent. We don't know this. But these are living memories in Argentina today. This memory space is actually a formal naval academy, a training school for military people that, many years into democracy was converted, or during the dictatorship, it functioned as a clandestine detention and torture center. About 5,000 people were killed in this particular, what is now a museum. So this is one way of keeping memory alive in Argentina. And I would argue that the policy of having people disappear is actually one of the most brutal violations, because people keep up their hopes that they're actually going to find their family members again. And this particular kind of crime has provoked both military and civilians and formed the basis for many court cases, which I'm going to get to in a little while. Now, in the project that I mentioned, we tried to take stock of how civilian governments have tried to deal with these massive human rights violations. This is the definition, if you want, that we came up with of accountability. We have looked at 4 different things in this project. One is truth-finding, which means trying to document human rights violations through Truth Commission reports. We also looked at criminal prosecution through national courts. We looked at reparations to victims. They could be either material or symbolic. And we looked at efforts to guarantee non-repetition, which means measures put in place to prevent human rights violations from happening again in the future. And this could mean institutional reform, legal reform, constitutional reform, reform of the police, reform of the military, human rights education, re-educating judges. There's a whole wide range of different policies. One of them was to set down a truth commission. And this has been a very typical measure used in many Latin American countries. We have examined 11 truth commissions in 9 countries. There are 2 more in the making at the moment in Bolivia and in Colombia. I also know that this is a measure which has been widely used in Latin America. It has also been widely used in Africa. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is probably the most well-known of all truth commissions. It has very rarely been used in Muslim countries. I know there has been one in Morocco, one in Tunisia, I think in Lebanon, and in Asian Muslim-dominated societies in Nepal and in East Timor. And there have been several commissions in South Korea. But this is mainly, or it started off as a Latin American phenomenon. And this is important because the military have actually tolerated these commissions. And why have they tolerated civilian governments to document the abuses that they have committed? Because they have negotiated or passed amnesty laws to protect themselves from criminal prosecution. And this is one of the things that have hindered prosecution in many countries for many years. Now, another thing I should have mentioned is that these commissions are normally set up at the time of transition or during the first civilian government, but sometimes it takes a long time. This picture is a picture of the head of the Brazilian Commission handing over the final Truth Commission report to the then President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. This happened in December 2014. This is the latest final report that was finalized in Latin America. The violations that are documented in this particular report were actually committed in the 70s and the 80s, which means that there is a 30, 40-year span between the commitment of the abusers and the actual documentation and formal state recognition. This is important. It's also important that the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, is not a fan of human rights. He is a deep admirer of the past authoritarian regime. He has close ties to the military, and he's not very likely to do anything about all the recommendations that this particular commission took months and months and months to deliberate. So all this to say is that having a document, having a human rights commission is not enough. You also need political will to follow up the recommendations. Moving on to something which I've been working on for many, many years, and it's hard to sum up this in just a minute, but I will try. If you look at the top picture to the left, you see a march of people claiming justice, justicia, in Spanish. These are claims for justice that started during dictatorships and during armed civil war in practically all of these countries. And these claims continue until this day. They have mobilized thousands of people. And there has been a response. Somebody in the first panel on the first day mentioned that it was not a good idea to prosecute the military because you would provoke a coup. Okay? So it's better to leave those things buried and forgotten. Now, the only country on the continent that actually tried to prosecute its military at the time of transition was Argentina. The picture you see to your right, in black and white, this is a picture from the world-famous trial of the juntas in 1985. As you well know, the military in Argentina lost the war against Britain in the Falklands War, or Las Malvinas. They were discredited, they lost power, they had to transfer power to a democratically elected president. He promised that he would prosecute the military during his election campaign, and he did. At the beginning, he tried to prosecute the whole military. There were 3 coup attempts or revolts, military revolts. He shrunk his ambitions. He ended up trying to prosecute only the top military brass in the juntas. He managed to prosecute 7 generals. 5 of them ended in jail with quite high sentences. Come in the next president, he thought it was better to forgive and forget. He let all the generals out of jail. We were back to square one. But this is an historic judgment because there's only one other country in the world that has tried to prosecute its military at the time of transition, and that was Greece, Turkey's neighbor. Okay, so this is world famous. And I can also mention that 15 years later, there were new demands for justice in Argentina, and the court cases started rolling. First civil cases in around 2000, and then it exploded later. So at the moment, there are thousands of charges brought against the military, not only the military actually, but also military accomplices. There have been judges and doctors put on trial in Argentina with thousands and thousands of witnesses. So these court cases are rolling. If we move away from Argentina to the middle picture, do you recognize who this is? Pinochet, Chile, world famous. Why is he world famous? Detained in London, returned to Chile, and he was prosecuted nationally by his own courts, who he thought were loyal to him after all his reforms, but he died in detention, so he never actually got a jail sentence. There were 200 cases against him. Down to your right, you see Efraín Ríos Montt, the ex-general and ex-president or head of state of Guatemala, responsible for some of the worst atrocities, around 200,000 people killed in genocide. This is the first time in world history that a former head of state has been prosecuted successfully for genocide in a national court by a female judge, who I'm very proud of. Now, the Constitutional Court in Guatemala undid the verdict, and the man died before anything else could be done. He died last year. So, but he was prosecuted and convicted. The bottom left picture is Alberto Fujimori, former president of Peru, who was detained in Chile, extradited to Peru. His case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he was successfully convicted in 3 different trials, got 25 years in jail. His daughter, who's been running for presidency twice, is now in jail for corruption. Keiko. Okay. If you try to look at the continent as a whole, how much accountability has there been for human rights violations? Now, this is complex material with a lot of data. 9 countries, 30 years, lots of activity. We have tried to sort of reduce this to numbers. So we have created an accountability scale where 0 signifies, no action against the military. Accountability with a score of 10 means that you have done everything you can possibly do. If you look at prosecutions, there is 1 line for every of the 9 countries, okay? There is only 1 peak in 85. That is the junta's trial in Argentina. Everything else starts moving around the year 2000. So if the line goes up, it means more accountability. If the line is flat, it means nothing is happening. If it goes down, it means you've had progress and setbacks. Argentina comes up as on top, and Brazil is the country that has done the least. This is a graph showing you achievements across truth-finding, fighting amnesty laws, prosecutions, and reparations. There's huge variation between the countries. Argentina is still best in the class, which I think coincides with the analysis we heard yesterday about Argentina. And El Salvador is the country which has done the least. This is just to give you a picture of what has been going on in Latin America. But what is important to note here is that every single one of these 9 countries have actually done something to hold the military to account. The question is, why is this happening so late? So the dictatorships were in the 70s and the 80s. So why is this happening 2000, 2010, 2015? Why so late? Now, I think there are some important factors that have to be in place when we look at this empirically. One is independent courts, which constitute a necessary but not sufficient condition for ensuring criminal accountability for past human rights violations. So, independent courts. Second, 3 more crucial factors. One, which we have discussed in this conference, is the absence of credible military threat. Second, a sustained demand for justice from civil society actors and their allies, be they national or international. Three, a sufficient legal basis for judicial action in human rights cases. This means that you have to have laws that allow the judiciary to act on criminal cases. And it also means that amnesty laws have to either be thrown out or bypassed by judges, which has happened in all these countries. The last point, which is very important for Latin America, but which may not be relevant for the MENA region, is the regional and international development in human rights law and jurisprudence. This has been crucial in many countries. And before I'm told to stop, I want to give you 7 important insights from this region. Some of them overlap with what I've just said. So, first of all, holding the military accountable right after transitions to democracy has historically been almost impossible. The more time that passes between the time of transition and the actual prosecutions, the more likely you are to have successful trials. And why is this? First of all, as you saw in the pictures, many of those who actually end up in trial are retired generals, they're out of office, they're old, they're frail, they can't really do much harm, they don't have much power. Another, I think, important point is that as time goes by, you get new, fresh blood into the military, and a lot of them actually want to distance themselves with what happened in the dictatorship period because they haven't been part of it. They haven't served in the army, and they have a new role in democratic society, and they don't really want to have the stamp of being, having abused their population, civilians in their own country. Third, which I mentioned already, is that it really helps to have a pro-human rights and pro-accountability civil society. Civil society in many countries are responsible for documenting, collecting information, hearing witnesses, receiving information, and putting this information together and putting pressure on the government. This is crucial. It's also crucial how government responds to this pressure, how government responds to these demands. It is much easier to act on these issues if there is political will to do anything. Finally, you need independent courts, independent judges. Sometimes it helps just to have 2 good judges can get a lot done. You also need the presence or absence of amnesty laws is not what tips the balance, but you have to have the legal space to do the prosecutions. In Latin America, the Inter-American Court and Commission have been crucial. And I want to move on to the final slide here, which is a big debate. In 20 seconds, the implications for democracy and human rights by carrying out prosecutions and dealing with past violations, what are they? I think democratic deliberations, which have been encouraged as part of Truth Commission's work, has been very important in many countries. In, for example, Chile, there was the civilian government invited the military literally to a round table. Mesa de Diálogo it was called the Table of Dialogue. So civilians and military sat down, discussed how to grapple with the problem of human rights. This was copied by Uruguay later, quite successfully so. Another point is that through policies of memorialization, which means, like the museum I showed you a picture of, the ESMA Museum, or having public spaces, monuments, museums, street names, public spaces, where normal civilians can go and think about the dictatorship and the crimes that were committed, and it's also in honor of the victims. This is something that helps people not forget what happened. I think dealing with human rights violations, especially through the courts, has actually strengthened the rule of law, which is, I think, one of the main pillars of a functioning democracy, because it shows that nobody is above the law. And if you can't hold those who make the worst violations accountable, how can you then criminally prosecute petty criminals, you know, who steal because they don't have enough to eat? There wouldn't be any feeling of justice in that. So this is also a point. Trust in democratic institutions, I think, has increased. Especially trust in the judiciaries has gone up as a result of these processes. I think over time there has also been an increased right-wing tolerance for human rights policies. I would argue this for the case of Chile, where even the most Pinochet-friendly people will not today have the guts to say that this did not happen. They did right after the transition. Today, everybody acknowledges that these atrocities took place. Finally, regardless of what political parties support or don't support human rights, I think they have definitely been put on the political agenda, and I think this is central to the development and the consolidation of a proper democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Hawaz. Dr. Hawaz is head of Gulf Studies at Al Jazeera Center for Studies. He has contributed to numerous publications, such as The Blockade over Qatar. Dr. Hawaz has given public speeches in many universities all over the world. He will speak to us today about the role of civil society and civic organizations in democratic transitions. Please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Thank you for SIGA for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the civil society and the role of civil society in converting military regime to democratic one. So my approach of the relation between civil society and military from the angle of transition from the military regime to democratic one. I will address this subject in 4 levels to assess the effectiveness of civil society in the democratization of the Muslim society. The first level is global one. The question that I will answer in the global level is appropriate for the action of civil society to play this role of democratization. I mean by global level the industrial civilization and liberal one. The second level of my talk is a regional one. Is the regional one appropriate for civil society to play this role of democratization? And I mean by the regional one, the MENA region. The third level, is there any necessity, is there any necessity between civil society and democratization, or it isn't necessary that even if we have a civil society, it isn't a cause to have a democratic or democratization? And the fourth level, we conclude by the uses and abuses of civil society regarding to the democratization. So we start by the global level. We know from the Saint-Simonian and Auguste Comte that we are now living in industrial civilization, and we are now in a post-industrial civilization, and the meaning and what we can get from this for our talk, that the glory, the value of glory isn't like in the past. Now the utility and the merchant value are now getting the priority in this new society. So that means we downgrade the military and we give a positive value, or we prioritize the merchant and the growth and economic and utility. So we have a new level of value or priority. That means we don't praise, we don't value like in the past, the military. And I think this is a trend, a big trend, will shape our civilization and our future. So the value of glory isn't valuable like in the past, and it is a room and an opportunity for the civil society and for democracy to be implemented. So we have this trend, decline of military value. And also we have another trend, liberal values. That means we give importance for the citizen and for the right, human rights, as my colleague mentioned in her presentation. So this is another trend, and the military regime cannot abuse these human rights, because they will be regarded as it will be regarded as negative and as a violation of a very important value in our current civilization. That's mean now this is another trend. So we have at least two trends. We have this now we prioritize the merchant value, and also we prioritize the liberal or the individual value, and these two trends gives a room for the civil society to act and to implement a democratic regime. And we mean by what we mean by military regime. The military regime, I mean the social institution who monopolizes violence and monopolizes the legitimacy of using violence. And we identify also the state as as Max Weber defined the state as the social institution who has the legitimacy of using violence. And in our new society, there is an opposition between individual and the state, because sometimes the state can misuse, can abuse using violence against the citizen. That's mean oppression, and the state can oppress its citizens. So in our liberal society, as I mentioned, in our civilization, put the value of human rights on the top of its priority. And so this is a new change. There is an opposition appears between the state and individuals. In the past, the state control and has a legitimacy to treat her people not, its people not like a citizen, but like a subject. And Michel Foucault had analyzed this question largely. And also we have another trend. We have a global awareness. We are in the, because we have this global awareness because of the danger and the challenges all the humanity face. One of them, the environmental dangers. So we need to gather our forces and to face the same danger, and we feel for the first time that we are in the same world because we are connected, and no one will be safe if anything happened to our globe. So we have this with this awareness. Another trend will shape our future and impact the role of civil society. The new technology, new technology can now connect people and individuals and let them, give them offer them the possibility to create a community facing the common challenge. And now the organization like Human Rights Watch and others using this platform technology to carry their action in the world. So this is the trend in the global level. I will talk now, and all of them give the opportunity for the civil society. They give them the room to work, to create this kind of solidarity between people and to face the common challenges. In the regional level, we have also a trends offering possibility for civil society to face or to create network in order or in the way to face the common challenge. In the international level, we know that the civil society are praised and they design the civil society as the driver of democracy and the Western power now, since the 80s and the 90s, rely on the civil society in order to change the authoritarian regime to change them to a democratic regime like what's happened in east of Europe. And also in our region, we remember that Bush cited the report about the development in the Arab world, published by the PNUD, as an evidence that this is a call from this region, from the civil society, to implement the democracy in this region. Also, there is another trend, gives the civil society an opportunity to work in this region. The failure of many states like Yemen, like Libya, and this failure gives the civil society, first it creates a need of solidarity and give for the civil society, offer them an opportunity to create another options to face a common challenge. Also, the wave of Arab Spring boosts the civil society in the region because civil society has had and now has played a huge role in this wave, in the Arab Spring, and what is happening now in Sudan, in Algeria, and also in Egypt, demonstrate that civil society is an important driver in the change of this military regime. So now the third axis of my presentation. The main difference, because now as I said, there is empowerment of civil society, and now civil society is regarded as valuable in our civilization. There is, and as I mentioned, there is the value of military, the glory is not like the past. Is there any ontologic or any essential difference between civil society and military regime? My answer is yes. There is at least two. For the civil society, the identity of civil society is to be autonomous and using persuasion in its action, because they don't use violence, they haven't guns, and to be autonomous. This is the definition of the civil society. For the military, military don't like any autonomy, because they view the society as a threat, as a danger. So they want to control and to impose obedience at all the part of the society. So there is antagonistic relation between both, but this in the general level, theoretical one, is like, in Max Weber, the ideal type. But, in a concrete, in a historical concrete, in a concrete experience, we should study every experience in its context. For example, sometimes in our history and the history of the other experience, there is a cooperation between them, and as one of our experts said in his presentation, the experience of Sudan demonstrated that behind the military coup there is a civilian appeal. And also we can see the experience of Egypt. The free officers rely on the brotherhood in what they call the revolution. So we have, and also the experience of Sudan, Turabi and Bashir in the beginning of the 90s. My other question, is there any necessity between civil society and that's meaning the civilian aspect and the democracy? No. We have plenty of experience. For example, Hitler was a civilian, and Mussolini was a civilian. So there is no automatic relation between being civilian and democratic by essence. So it isn't enough. Is it civil society always inclusive? No, it isn't necessary. I can say it, for example, the example of Nahda. Ben Ali used the concept of civil society to exclude the Nahda from the political arena, because in his view and the view of his allies, civil society is by essence secular, and we cannot allow a religious player to be apart. So sometimes we use civil society to oppress and to exclude our opponents. The conclusion. So civil society, as I demonstrated in trends I mentioned, has the opportunity and the capacity by the new technology to drive democratic change in the Muslim region, but we should be aware of the traps, of the concept, and the strategy that may be the use, this concept, the abuse of the abuse of the concept of civil society. Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Hawaz Taqiyya. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Ijaz Akram from the National Defense University of Pakistan.
Can I speak from here?
Yes, of course, but let me just introduce you real quick. Dr. Ijaz Akram is presently serving as advisor with Faculty of Contemporary Studies in National Defense University of Islamabad. He holds a PhD in world politics from the Catholic University of America, as well as 2 master's degrees. Dr. Akram also worked at the American University of Cairo, as well as the Franklin College in Switzerland. He also published several books, scholarly articles, and reviews and editorials. Dr. Ijaz will talk to us about a paradigm for civil-military relations in Muslim societies. Please.
Thank you very much. We have a 20-minute slot? Yes. 20 minutes, all right. So I'll try to stick within my time frame. You know, we approach this subject, which is rather, it's a narrow subject within the whole gamut of political science, security studies, IR theory, what have you, global studies, and so, you know, civil-military relations is a narrower subfield of something much, much larger. And, but at the same time, it's very, very important, and it is very important from my point of view to get the theory of this subject right. The epistemology of this subject, how do we know what we know? So when we say, you know, there's a quest for democracy, in order to have democracy, we should get the civil-military relations right. So we work with the ontological a priori assumption that democracy is an unalloyed good, which must be striven for, and the general theory of civil-military relations, balance and everything, we constantly make references to the West. Now that may be correct, may be incorrect, but we have to put it to the test of scrutiny. So, and it's also, you know, the whole Western theory of knowledge, modern Western theory of knowledge. We're not talking about Christianity and Judaism here as yet, but the modern theory of knowledge, as far as its link with modernism is concerned, it is characterized, all modernism is characterized by loss of transcendence. So in such thinking, for many people, maybe, you know, Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism or Islam or Christianity actually plays no significant role in trying to guide or trying to bring a thinking for what ought to be a balanced relationship between these two and whether or not democracy is an unalloyed good. So, so I thought, you know, who am I? You know, of course, I'm from Pakistan, and you know, I'm also an American, and I'm also Punjabi, and I'm also, you know, partially maybe Turkish by ethnicity, and so forth. So identities are multiple and so forth. But there's something single that is plays much greater role in my thinking, as in the case of many of us. And that's my worldview, which is primarily coming from Islam. Now, what does that have any significant, is that going to be a sufficient guide for me to give me some kind of clues or guide me with an epistemology as to how I can come about with a proper conception of a balance between civil and military. For Muslim civilization, having standing armies is no problem. For Buddhist civilization, it is a problem. For historical Christianity, it was a problem. They had to sidestep the sayings of Christ, given to Caesar, that is Caesar, and given to God, that is God, St. Augustine of Hippo, city of God, city of man. And so you have this an esoteric possibility of a secular thought from the very early Christianity. For Judaism, it does not pose any problem. And similarly for Islam, it does not pose any problem. The Quran says in Surah Al-Anfal 8:60, and prepare against them whatever you are able to of power and the steeds of war by which you may terrify the enemies of Allah and your enemies and others beside them whom you do not know, but Allah does know. So defense is a hukm. You must defend yourself. And then you go to the example of the Prophet. He was a supreme pontiff of Deen al-Islam. He was a prophet. He was a bearer of a book. But he was also a warrior. So many people can say from the pro-military point of view, the Prophet was a warrior, so that establishes that, defense is very important, and hence perhaps, military may be superior because after all, that was his function. But it is important to remember that that is not so, because his function as a prophet, which is bringing down the book of wisdom, was before picking up the sword to fight. But that does not still tell us that his function as a prophet, which is a bearer of the book, as a civilian function, and his function as a warrior, he fought 27 wars in which he directly participated, and more than 100 in which he did not physically participate, but nonetheless. So that does not prove that his military genius, he nearly won all of the wars, that his military genius was superior to his hikmah genius. All right? So the military function of the Prophet is secondary to his wisdom function, and it is in service of that wisdom function. But even that does not prove that the civilian aspect must dominate over the military aspect in Islamic societies, going back to the archetypes, the ultimate archetypes, as far as we can go as Muslims, as thinking Muslims, to look for a history of balance in this relationship. But what that does tell us that it's a primacy of knowledge over action. Now, that's the best we can come up with, that I can present to you, is the Islamic theory of civil-military relations, is the primacy of knowledge and piety, ilm and taqwa, over anything else. And in the case of the military function, it is action. So, East Asian civilization, you study Taoism, we find Wu Wei is non-acting action, is superior to action. Action is not inferior, it is needed, it is very, very important. As human beings, we have to act within time and space, which requires action. To eat is an action, to defend yourself is an action. So, now Islam is also a Unitarian paradigm. Muslims throughout the history we call them Muwahidun, the people of the unity. And hence that requires integration. That requires integration of contemplation and action, of knowledge and praxis, of civil and military. 30 presidents out of some 45 presidents in the United States of America have served military or certain other militias, and only 13 and 14 who did not serve. That's a very good example of integration. Switzerland, which does not have a standing army, but every citizen has a weapon and has training. A very good example of civil-military integration. Israel, almost entire society has some kind of training. It's a militarized society, militarized civil society. Where the state stops and the civil society begins, we do not know. It's a very good example of civil-military integration. Afghanistan, the Taliban. Now this might, don't jump up from your seats, please, but also are a relief organization, fighters. Don't listen to the global media, what they tell, that Americans are the good guys and Taliban the bad guys. I mean, come on, the story is quite opposite. After 48 countries raided them, and this ragtag army of, 45,000 people have actually, 18 years later, now the Americans are, please help us get out. And so they need the Afghan Taliban, and they need, obviously, the help of Pakistanis to get out. And so, good integration. So, divisions, either or. Binaries can be very useful. I love binaries, this or that and so forth, binaries. But we must insist on integration. This is our intellectual habit, and it is also a commandment. So the unity between family, unity between man and woman, unity between societies, unity between civilizations, and the unity of humanity, and the unity of environment. So I did not bring myself to this world, something else did, and I will not voluntarily take myself away, something else will. I'm loyal to myself, I'm loyal to my family, I'm loyal to my city, I'm loyal to my province, I'm loyal to my country, I'm loyal to my state, I'm loyal to the millet, I'm loyal to the ummat, I'm loyal to the insaniyat, and beyond the insaniyat, I'm loyal to the animal and the botanical world as well. It's not easy to actually practice integration of knowledge, but we must try, all right? So now I'll go to the second part of my argument, which is a discussion of current realities. The notion that democracy as the only legitimate form of government is problematic, or at least it's contestable. We cannot insult the intelligence of humanity that only, Francis Fukuyama said, from here onwards, democratic capitalism, this is the way, and it's my way or the highway, and nothing else. Our intelligence has reached its upper limits, and everybody else must remove their thinking caps, put the blindfold on, and follow. It's not like that. The West, as argued by Oswald Spengler, is in a state of irreversible decline. It does not actually use common sense. It does not actually pay you to follow the path of a sinking Titanic. There are others that are coming up. The West may not think that, Singapore is a humane society and so forth. The Chinese, have any social justice or economic justice and so forth. But that's their problem. United States of America, one of the most brainwashed places on earth. Fox News, CNN, BBC, even Discovery Channel and TLC and so forth. I mean, these are gospel hours in the evening, and people listen to them very carefully, and I think that we should not try to follow the gospel. We must try to think with our own intelligence and see very cleverly what we can do, and if democracy works for us, great, alhamdulillah. The Quran is silent on the form of government. It does not tell you whether kingship is superior, whether military rule is superior, whether this is superior. It's silent on the form of government. It is Kitab al-Insaf. It only insists on justice. If you can have a democracy that brings justice, great. If you can have a military rule that brings justice, restores justice and harmony, great. If you have a kingship that does it, great. So we have to look at the outcome. We cannot be emotional about the form itself. That's path dependence. How much minutes I have left? Oh my God, so I have to really, I was just warming up. So reference to the Western experience can be useful, but we should not limit ourselves to it. Now, if you're not a believer in the Western liberal democracy, then often, unfortunately, you are labeled as a dictator, autocrat, fascist, and it is the West who decides who is a Democrat or not. Front Islamique Salvation won the election. No, you're not a Democrat, get out of here. Sisi, get out of here. Iran, theocracy. China, commies. Only in the end, they have reached enlightenment. That's a highly problematic idea. Current reality is number 2. We have democracies in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, half the time, of course. Pakistanis can make a claim, we've been democratic. I don't think so, but okay, dynastic democracies maybe. India, you know, Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, Sanjay Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi. Oh my God. I mean, you know, it doesn't end. Same thing with Bangladesh, same thing in Pakistan. So it's a joke. Then you have the puppet democracies of the deep state, Trump, Modi, Netanyahu. Now, Modi just annexed Kashmir without any justification. 8-9 million people are in a state of lockdown. Hindutva thinks that they do not have citizenship rights. We will actually throw them out. Same thing in the Nagaland and other areas. People are very nervous. They don't have citizenship rights anymore. Is that really what democracy is? Largest democracy of the world. Oldest democracy of the world. Same thing, you know, we have Netanyahu just gobbled up Palestine. This is like, I mean, Israel, of course, but he's the current manifestation, was the current manifestation of the policies of Israelis. And also, I mean, you know, Israel is a very effective state, but in time to achieve its goals. But is the inner content of what they do, is that good for humanity? Has it been good for Palestinian? Has been good for Dr. Sami? No. So we must rethink about that as well. I want just 1 or 1.5 minutes extra. 9/11 was a false flag operation that resulted in a lot of carnage in the Muslim world. That led to a series of hybrid wars, the 4th and the 5th and the 6th generation wars. This is very important. We have to know where the war is headed before you can actually, you might want to rethink this whole framework that we are working with. I'm not hostile to this framework. You know, I don't have any problems living in Scandinavia. I don't have any problems living in Iran. I may have problems living in Saudi Arabia. But hybrid wars in which there's a war against our identity, war is no longer objective. It is being fought in media and academia, and it's entering inside your head. All resistance to these wars must be removed. If religion helps you bring about solidarity and fight the forces of oppression, remove religion through deep secularization. If the states have large military that actually have a problem in your preference of geopolitics, enervate the militaries. Family, same thing. Gender, you know, somebody gave a very excellent presentation, you know, militaries are from Mars and civilians are from Venus and so forth. Being man is almost difficult these days, you know, it's like much easier being a woman these days. And civil society, its identification with the feminine and the military with the masculine and the man is a problem. This whole concept is also problematic. I mean, somebody mentioned it to make a justification, but it may be at the back of people's mind when you approach civil-military relations, because the civilians are soft and cuddly and gentle and so forth, and the evil military men who are out there to bludgeon everybody into submission. I mean, this is a caricature of the real situation and so forth. So these things play upon people's consciousness that has been sort of leveled for the years and years of indoctrination that may be from cartoons to Hollywood. Now, what lessons can we learn? In the US, of course, like I said, there is visible civil-military relations and there's a hidden one. And then you have Russia, China, which has probably very close civil-military integration because of the nature of the Communist Party. The Chinese military is not a national military, is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And Xi Jinping, which heads that military commission now, is only there because the military is still loyal to him. His deputies are against him. He's isolated within the Politburo. Why? Because he went against the liberals who were facing charges of corruption. And so while he is self-isolated in his castle, the only thing that will actually save his principal stance against corruption, the military commission. So then you have the militaries of the Muslim world. Now, one thing I want to mention, I've been listening to the talks for the last 2-3 days. The Arab world is not a good guide. The knowledge of civil-military relations in the Arab world is not a good guide in understanding the CMR of countries like Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And I think that we have to, and I didn't even touch Indo-Malay region, but this is very, very important that we actually, I will conclude now.
Yeah, we can maybe continue in the question and answer session.
Yes, let me conclude. So going back to that, we have to basically look at these civil-military relations in the light of the current realities, and in which the only solution you have in order to strengthen the civil society, you must build the capacity of the civil society, and you must also strengthen the state. If you weaken the state, you will have Daesh and ISIS on your footsteps. And you know who created these organizations, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, and so forth. You know, they have a foreign link. They are not necessarily just a result of homegrown Islamism. There's a political economy of this organization that is linked with outside forces. Of course, they have local elements, but and then secondly, you must de-Westernize your theories of knowledge. And in order to center yourself, you must look at the world with your own eyes and not with the eyes of the other. That will not, you must draw from your own resources and experience in order to eliminate dependence, intellectual and material. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For our final speaker, is it ready? Okay. Yes, so our final speaker is going to speak to us through FaceTime. Okay, while we have him on screen, Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl, he's going to talk to us about Islam, authoritarianism, and the civil-military relations. Dr. Abul Fadl is a professor of law at UCLA School of Law, founder of the Institute of Advanced Usul Studies. He is also author of numerous books and articles on Islam and Sharia, Islamic law, and Islamic jurisprudence. Among those books are Reasoning with God, The Research for Beauty in Islam, and The Great Theft. Dr. Abul Fadl has received his BA in Political Science from Yale University, Master's and PhD in Islamic Law from Princeton University. Dr. Abul Fadl, you can start. We have 20 minutes for you. If you can stick to time, I would be thankful. You can go ahead. We are listening to you, Dr. Abul Fadl. Can you hear us? Dr. Khalid, can you hear us? Okay. Can you fix this, please? Yes, can you hear us? Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I can hear you, so I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Okay. First, thank you very much for inviting me, and I apologize that I cannot join you in person. I would have very much loved to be a part of this conference in person. Unfortunately, I couldn't. I know that I am the last speaker in this conference, so I will not keep you long. Inshallah, I'll keep my comments limited. First, I'm not going to talk about Islamic tradition in general, because this is a very broad topic, and there is always the risk of essentializing a complex historical process. What I focus on are okay, can you hear me better?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's clear. It's clear.
Yeah, what I will focus on is an aspect of Islamic discourses that have proven very useful to despotism, aspect of Islamic discourses in our modern context that de-emphasize justice, political justice, as a core value in civilian society, and that have been employed to legitimate a stark equation of power as a basis for legitimacy and justification within Islamic polities. More specifically, I address a form of Salafism that emerged particularly in response to the Sahwa movement in the Arab world, commonly known as Jami or Madkhali Salafism, which has employed terminology and concepts within the Islamic tradition in ways that have become a serious obstacle to any processes that attempt to empower civil society or democratic processes in modern day Muslim countries, particularly the Muslim countries of the Arab world. As I'm sure most of you know, or all of you know, that within the Islamic tradition, the initial idealism that marked discourses on the institution of the Khilafah quickly encountered many socio-historical problems on the ground, and Islamic political thought struck what I think was a natural compromise, especially that the Islamic political discourse in medieval Islam, in the Islamic tradition, was a discourse generated essentially by jurists, by people of law and legal systems. Within the guilds of law and the institutions of fuqaha, the jurists, the very natural concept that was resorted to not just in the Islamic legal tradition, but also in Roman law and the common law system, in every legal system that we are able to study from a comparative perspective, the Islamic jurists resorted to the notion of shawka, basically that whichever government, whichever institution of power is able to establish itself and maintain a minimum amount of order and stability, and is thus enabled to resolve conflicts and resolve disputes, legal disputes, in orderly and stable fashion, becomes the political institution worthy of obedience. This is known in Islamic political thought as ta'at al-mutaghallib, or khilafat, or imamat al-mutaghallib. And the essential core concept here is that whoever possesses the shawka, the ability to institute stability and order, becomes a legitimate ruler. This, as a historical concept used in legal discourses by lawyers, and lawyers by the nature of the sociology of law are not prone to endorsement of rebellion and are not prone to the endorsement or even thinking about revolutionary movements was a understandable historical compromise, a practical compromise, and some might even argue that it was a necessary compromise. الطاعة المتغلب, or obeying the usurper of power, as long as that usurper of power has the shauka, the ability to institute a system of order and stability, was within its historical context definitely a natural development and an understandable one. However, the Imamat al-Mutaghallib and the theology or the legal discourses around the Shawka were often coupled with a very complex and layered and often highly contextual and highly contingent language about orthodoxy and heterodoxy, who can be considered an outlier in society, who can be considered a part of the mainstream, and therefore we have a rather complex linguistic practice, practice about Ahl al-Ahwa, wal-Bid'ah, wal-Baghi, wal-Fasad, and so on and so forth. And this language is, again, if studied within its specific historical contingencies, within its specific historical context that produced it, one can understand the ways that Muslim scholars attempted to negotiate a sense of orthodoxy and mainstream by employing language that attempted to identify outliers within society and those within the mainstream. Now, of course, all of this is not the issue as far as I'm concerned. In the modern age, the language of Shawka has been moved from the realm of political compromise by groups such as Madkhali Salafism and Jami Salafism and similar intellectual movements to a point of sanctification and sacralization, where the importance of stability and order is given a higher priority, in fact, sometimes an essential and core priority that trumps all, that in fact invalidates and marginalizes all other normative demands such as justice or equity or fairness or any substantive moral issue, to the point that Shawka al-Ta'a becomes the singular normative injunction within the Islamic political tradition. In the linguistic debates and discourses of Jami and Madkhali Salafism, often there is a very common phrase that the problem in the modern age is not istibdad, it's not despotism, but it is a tamarrud, or dissent. And there is a form of idealism and puritanism in which there is a desire to prefer orthodoxy, particularly orthodox beliefs, al-aqa'idiyya, and purification of system of beliefs as a priority that trumps any other legal or political or moral consideration in society. In the same vein, we find that in this type of movement, which is quite popular in places like Egypt and Yemen and Libya and Syria, and of course Saudi and the Emirat, particularly where it emerged in Saudi. In this type of discourse and this type of theology, there is an emphasis on what is often called a tajrih instead of ta'dil. In other words, an emphasis on correct aqidah, on correct belief, rather than a concern about political institutions or even concepts like civil society. Within this Salafi movement, pluralism, as well as democracy, as well as institutions such as political parties, are considered a form of tahazzub, a form of unnecessary divisions within society, and in fact, an emphasis that al-hizbiyya is a form of ahwa and manahij bid'iyya, that parties, by their nature, is a form of indulgent whimsy and instituting deviation within society. Now, I am assuming, for the sake of this presentation, that this movement is not simply a movement that was produced by the institutions of despotic and repressive state. In other words, I'm assuming that this institution actually has an intellectual core and that it has ideas that it espouses for normative purposes, and that it is not simply an invention by the police state and is not simply funded by the police state to serve its own purposes, but I'm assuming that in fact they are sincere in what they argue and believe in. The problem, though, is that if tamarrud, if dissent, is seen as a far greater problem than istibdad, than despotism, and if differences in opinions and pluralism, whether social pluralism or political pluralism, is seen as a form of ahwa and bid'ah and bagh, and the ultimate accusation, a form of khawarij, or ifsad al-ard, a form of reconstituting the demonized political movement of the Khawarij in Islamic history, and a form of corrupting on earth. And if, in fact, the democratic process is seen as simply a form of tahazzub and ibtida' and so forth, it is natural that then nothing remains of civil society as a philosophical paradigm within the thinking of the Salafi movement. And in fact, within the context of the Arab world, in the Arab world, military institutions, since colonialism, have often been preserved and sustained as institutions with near monopoly over power. And there is a mythology that is often embraced by Salafi movements and non-Salafi movements, that out of the entire civil society in the post-colonial Arab world, it is only the military that has succeeded in preserving an institutional hierarchy, while all other institutions in society have proven their failure. It is natural for this type of Salafi movement then to glorify and to sanctify the ability or to glorify and sanctify whatever institution can deliver what they see as the shelter, as the ability to obtain and maintain obedience and order, even if the cost is injustice, and even if the cost is high despotism.
Dr. Khalid?
We see this movement, of course, the Jami al-Madkhali Salafi movement, which
Dr. Khalid?
Ironically supported the coup in Egypt, and which is staunchly loyal to both the police and the army as the core institution worthy of salvation in Egyptian society. We saw the same movement in Libya side with the Libyan army despite the revolution, and see the Wifaq government as simply a form of ibtida' and a form of heterodoxy that deviates from what Islam would legitimate or endorse. We also saw the same movement in Yemen, but here the tendency in Yemen is to see the Shawka as residing either with the Emirat and the military order of the Emirat, or with Saudi and the military order of Saudi, and to see all other democratic movements within the Yemeni context as a heterodox deviation and a form of heretical ibtida' in Islam. I don't want to over-exaggerate because I strongly disagree with the type of thesis that Samuel Huntington endorsed or argued, and that is very influential within American political institutions, that Islam by its nature is a despotic tradition, and that by its nature Islamic theology cannot understand pluralism or democracy. So it is important to qualify everything I say as a core value of a particular type of Salafism, not even the Sahwa Salafism, and definitely not the Salafism of the Ikhwan. But there is a problem, is that among the arch enemies of the Madkhali and Jami Salafism is specifically the Ikhwan and the Sahwa, because of their endorsement of democratic values and pluralistic values, and because they don't see ta'ah, obedience to the ruler, as a theological, stand-alone, normative paradigm within the Islamic tradition. But if the only Islamic movements, i.e. the Ikhwan and the Sahwa and similar organizations that have endorsed democracy and pluralism as a normative value to be thought after within the Islamic tradition, are demonized as a form of Khawarij and as Ahl al-Ahwa and Bid'ah, then we end up with a very serious problem. Because the only form of Islam that is allowed to exist outside of prisons in places like the Emirat, Saudi, Egypt, Libya, and the Libya of Haftar, and so on and so forth, is in fact the Islam of the Shawka wa Ta'a, and the Islam that ultimately, whether we like it or not, is an Islam that ends up sanctifying and uplifting istibdad, despotism, as a natural state of order, even if the cost is justice. Thank you very much for your patience. I know I'm the last speaker, and I didn't want to keep you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
I
Khalid.
still can't hear you, so, or now I can hear you.
All right, so thank you very much to Dr. Khalid. Dr. Ellen, if you can join us back.
Ah, okay.
I have a few questions, but I'm gonna go right to the audience to save time, and then if my questions are not answered, I'll get back to them. Let's start with. Okay, I'm gonna start with Miss here. In your mic. Go ahead, please. And please keep your question limited to a few seconds. Can we have another mic? All our mics are off, guys. The mics are tired. Okay, back on.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. My name is Leila Mahdi. I would like to follow on what Dr. Ijaz Akram said. It was very interesting that you went back to the Prophet's time and that he was not only a prophet, but he was also a military leader. And it just made me think about even the society then, before Islam. The people, when there is a war, they go, all the men collect, and sometimes even the women, and they go to fight that war, and they live together in the war times and in the peace times. So it's very interesting that the people in that society, and many years afterwards, in the Islamic State, the people were the civil, and they were the military members themselves. So they were, or they share the stakes. They have everything at stake, at peace times and at war times. So it's a very interesting dilemma that now in the modern society, we are deprived out of our choices to make whether in civil or war times. For example, teaching of our kids belongs to the state. Training our military belongs to the state. So they get to choose what goes into our brain. But you're always deprived of one end. Either if you're a military, you might be deprived of your spiritual force. If you're a civilian, you might be deprived of your physical force. So there is always a cell missing, whether it's a brain cell or a muscle cell or a spiritual
Can we get to the
force.
question, please?
So the question, it's actually not a question, but it's a very interesting point that he stated here.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if that's the way forwards to get out of the dilemma of integration between the civil and the military forces. Whether we need to politicize the military, or do we need to militarize the society for them to be able to integrate?
Thank you very much. We'll have one question here in the back, and then we'll follow by Dr. Aqil, and we'll have this gentleman in the third row afterwards.
Okay, thank
Go
you
ahead.
all for your presentations. I will follow up with Dr. Akram. I admire thinking out of the box, and I think that he has a lot of points that worth studying, even for those from the Western culture. Despite his anger with some of their concepts. I will pick up from the comment of this man, just so we have that military as a career wasn't available at the time of the Prophet. It only started to be a career and independent department of the society in Umar ibn al-Khattab era. So that's something to notice, and we will follow up about that later, hopefully. My question is this: if we will be integrated between civil and military, how do we make the political life and the general administration life peaceful without just lying on the power? And actually that's why everybody is afraid of military, because they can use force to shut down others. In your paradigm, how will you make sure that they won't? Thank you very much.
Dr. Aqil, second row.
Yeah. My question is to Mr. Akram, your presentation has so many holes. It actually has more holes than Swiss cheese. And I'm afraid I speak for myself that I'll have to take a shower after this, because I have never heard such crackpot, conspiratorial views in a serious academic conference. I mean, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your facts. There's no hypothesis, no theory, no evidence, no logic, no research. And you've created, I mean, the worst kind of reverse Orientalism by justifying despotism in the name of Islam. That somehow this essentialist Islam in which the church and the state, or the mosque and political authority are fused. I mean, you're like the brown Bernard Lewis, unfortunately, although he had actual academic credentials.
Dr. Akil, if we can have a question.
No, we can't, because
please.
when I spoke, he had 2 minutes, so I deserve to, I need to get back. The hypocrisy really surprises me. You want to live in Scandinavia, but you want to subject others to the brutality of the Taliban. You are insulting the intelligence and memory of the people who went out in the street and Tahrir Square and everywhere else to rise against despotism. You're trivializing and justifying the horrific sexual assault and rapes that have occurred because your fragile male ego is somehow hurt and you are finding it really hard to live as a man. No, sorry. Okay.
Dr. Akil.
It's not personal. It's
Akil.
not personal at all. It's not. You shut up. You have nothing to do with this. Shut
All right,
up.
guys.
No.
If we can.
Okay.
If we can please have a question.
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead. Otherwise, let's move on.
No. Okay. So, facts. The world's largest Muslim country is Indonesia, which is democratic. So I don't know where you come up with this bizarre idea that somehow Muslims and democracy, or democracy is a Western concept. 2, we live in a world of state nations for better or worse. And a modern society's needs are not the same as the society of a tribal society in the 7th century. So I'm really at a loss on where you come from. I would like you to present some evidence, some research, some theory, some evidence, because otherwise to me it sounds like, those theories which say aliens cause Ebola or the CIA causes tornadoes. I mean, there's no causal story, there's no methodology, so I'm really at a loss.
Dr. Akil, all right. We have this last question. Not last question, but go ahead.
My question is very simple for Dr. Aaron.
Thank you very much.
There is many ways to document the crimes that the regime is doing right now. So is there any way we can trust the international courts to judge these people, or there is no way we can rely on them? That's only my question. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a last question for this round, and if we have time, we'll go for another round.
Okay, my question for Professor Eileen. Thank you for lecture. But let me, please correct me if I'm wrong. I concluded from your lecture that if you would like to to investigate human rights violations, we should wait until the democracy consolidated after 10 years or 15 years, and then started inspections about human rights violations. Otherwise, we will not have democracy. If this right, do you think this is retrograde wisdom? Because no one can sell for the people who demand democracy that you should wait 10 years or 15 years till you get what you want. This is my question. Please elaborate on this. My second question for Professor Ijaz. Also, let me put it in this way, and please correct me if I'm right. You are suggesting, if I'm wrong, yes. Thank you. So, you are proposing integration between civilians and the military, and this is a very common trend in civil-military relations. But you putting this in that way, we are in exceptional situations. We have external threats. We are Muslim-dominant countries. We are exceptional. We are different from others. And to do this, we need to have a strong state, and strong state means strong military. But this leads us during the last 40, 50 years that we have the strong militaries, the weak states, and we don't have development, and we don't have democracy. Should we put the argument on its leg and say we should have strong state because we are exceptional threats, blah, 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 but this has become by having strong civilians, strong civilian institutions, strong civil society, and among those institutions, we have strong militaries who are dominated by civilians. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have some of my questions actually asked.
I was the first one to have my hands. You can't this way.
I am not closing the session.
I was the first one.
Okay, I would not like to see you upset. Please give him the mic and ask your question. No problem. We do have time, and I did say we will take another round. Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
It's a question of rule. Okay, please. So I will take 30 seconds. That's it.
Thank you.
My comments is directed to my friend from Pakistan. Your assumption is that, strong military rule leads to democracy. I think, give me an example in the whole world where we have democracy with military rule. By definition, any military order, is based, on hierarchy, on rules, on orders, in any democratic rule, there is not, space for consensus, for talking, for discussion. So, military rule is against democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we had a few misunderstandings. I'll leave that for Dr. Ijaz to clarify his opinion. I would like before to ask Dr. Hawaz. Dr. Hawaz, you talked about global trends and how those global trends lead to giving more room for local civil societies to face common challenges. And my question is, for the way forward and for a better civil-military relation in Muslim communities, given the expansion of those global and local trends for giving room for civil society, how longer will it take until we start seeing better civil-military relationships in Muslim communities? Let's take 2-3 minutes for each of our panelists, and then based on what remaining time we have, we'll have another round and maybe not. Okay.
Okay, thank you for your question. It's actually a matter of clarification, because I did not mean that you should wait many years to have justice for human rights violations. On the contrary, what I did say was that claims for justice actually start very often during the conflict or during the dictatorship. Also, the documentation of human rights violations usually takes place during the dictatorship, when civil organizations, victims organizations, NGOs, lawyers, family members actually record what happens. So these are processes that are ongoing while violations are ongoing. The point what I was trying to make is that empirically, it's very hard to prosecute. That means hold criminally responsible those who have committed the violations, simply because the political climate is usually very fragile at the time of transition, and democratically elected leaders, their number one goal is to stay in power, right? And they know that if they upset the military too soon, they risk a coup. So they wait. So empirically, it takes time. So politically, it's usually impossible. Another thing I mentioned was that you need independent courts. And very often, courts have not been functioning very well. They've either been accomplice, they've been out of order totally, or judges have been weeded out, replaced by military accomplices. So usually you need to clean up the justice system and reform it before judges can actually handle these cases. And thirdly, you need a legal basis for criminal prosecution, and very often those laws are not in place at time of transition. So the conditions are not right. It's not that I think it's a good idea to wait. I think it would be a very good idea to start earlier, but for various reasons, it's not possible. Yeah?
We have already examples of successful. We have the civil society in Tunisia, prized with the Nobel Prize. The syndicate played an important role during the revolution. We have currently also examples in Sudan. The civil society played an important role in the agreement between the revolutionary and the military. Also in Algeria, civil society now is playing an important role in the Hirak, in the revolution. It depends on which country. Yeah? But in another country, we have a real problem. Yeah? For example, in Yemen or in Syria. In this country, we cannot even say we should discuss the relation between military and democracy, because in Yemen, for example, we have no longer we have this national army. In Libya also we have only militia. So maybe in this country, civil society should militate for establishment of national army first, and then we try to find the balance between the civil regime and or democracy and military. So it depends on the context, but we have example of success. I mentioned Tunisia, and I mentioned Sudan and Algeria, and even in Egypt, even with this brutal dictatorship, we have civil society. Even now, it isn't weakened by military regime, but I think the picture the situation of the Arab or the Muslim world, Dr. Aqil, for example, mentioned other example of success. For example, Indonesia and Malaysia, we have a democracy and we have vibrant civil society. So the situation of the Muslim world isn't in the same level. So we have a different situation. Thank you.
Dr. Ejaz?
How many minutes?
I would appreciate if you can make it short and right to the points
I'll stick
raised.
to your time. You tell me how many minutes.
2-3 minutes, please.
2 minutes, all right. In 2 minutes, Dr. Rashid, your question. The assumption was not a strong military leads to a strong democracy, but a strong state. And a state in which there is, obviously, the military capacity building will be there, but the civil bureaucracy's capacity building has to be there so that slowly institutions can be developed, like the case of 1980s Japan, late 80s South Korea, even 90s, from 60s to 90s China as well, similar story. So all the civil society institutions that have to move in tandem with the institutions of the state, one cannot lag behind the other. So they have a symbiotic relationship together, move forward. If they don't and create an opposition, like it often happens in post-colonial states, is a double loss. So next question was the civil military integration by the gentleman here as to how it can be done and so forth. From country to country, you have to go different because some degree of opacity has to be there in the military decision making. You can't go public with everything. If you do, you weaken your defenses. If a civilian becomes a part of that, the military inside information circle, we will lose our freedom because high degree of clearances have to be obtained on us. And if they're done, then we lose our freedom. So some mechanism can be determined, like for example, officially, the state officials, the military officials actually don't tell you anything, but we know everything. That way, if I bring something on the table in terms of experience or analysis, that my military brother is not bringing, then I cannot make that policy or give some kind of analysis unless I know what he knows. And so the informal mechanisms of sharing information can be also developed. And so then I wouldn't respond to this gentleman because that's not a serious comment. I'll come to the lady here. Then we have this, the issue of whether to politicize military or civilianize military. So I think both. It's very hard to avoid politics in large organizations. So politicization of military is not good, but does the military have internal politics? It will always have. And should the military have a formal political role, like it does in China, for example? It has a formal military and diplomatic role enshrined in the constitution. May not be a bad idea, because the civilians just don't have the type of information that is needed timely to execute the types of decisions that high security states, such as Pakistan, for example, very high security state. It's a foreign policy state. It's not really a domestic policy state, because you got 9 hostile intelligence agencies working inside, trying to undermine just about every institution of the state, which is what they have done since 9/11. So in that type of atmosphere, of course, I think that internal politicization should be minimum, and the political role, formal political role in along with the people, and of course the agencies, the civilians and so forth, is indispensable. And the last question the gentleman just asked here, that you're right, the draft system comes much later on. The reason I selected the very early period is to try to explore in epistemology that is there any guideline for us in terms of having an integration. And the integration is principial. It may not necessarily be institutional, but it's principial and it's also intellectual. The at least minimum level of integration would be that our identities and our geographical predicament spews forth an idea about the geopolitics and what role we play in that geopolitics. In that, in as much as that is concerned, I think that that premise should be shared between the civilians and the military. It will make the life of military very easy, and it will also make life of civilians very easy. But in the earlier, when we read the theory of caliphate and the theory of imamate as they developed from Imam Mawardi, from Mawardi to Ghazali, we find that there is now much more elaborate in terms of, but the exemplar par excellence remains the same, which is the experience of the Prophet and the guidelines from the Quran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ijaz. Maybe outside later on you can catch up.
We can ask, yeah.
With this, we conclude. Thank you very much, everybody, and I would like to take it to Mr. Fadi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miqdad. Thank you, Eileen Iskar. Thanks, Dr. Hawass and Luay Safi, Ijaz Akram, and Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl, who was with us online. Thank you all. I'm now asking Dr. Sami to come to present the appreciation mementos for the speakers and moderator. Dr. Eileen. Dr. Hawass. Dr. Ijaz Akram. Dr. Miqdad. Meanwhile, I would like to announce tomorrow we will have a lecture by the Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool about lesson from South Africa, and it will be at 2 o'clock in the campus here. If you are interested, you can also follow our social media, Facebook and Twitter, SIGA Istanbul. Now, I would like to ask our staff to come to... Staff? Yes. Oh, yes. I would like... مش عارف. The awards for our staff. Is it ready? Yunus?
Let me say just a moment.
Okay.
I want to